Think of your favourite game. There are hundreds out there to choose from, with so many styles and genres that if you think of it, you can probably play it. So it might be a shock for you to hear me say that your favourite game was probably influenced by fantasy. This may be a bold statement to make, especially with the wide range of genres and niches within gaming, but it's true. Fantasy has been around for well over a century as of the present, and whether it be the classic stories with pointy-eared elves and swords, or more modern reinterpretations with beasts such as vampires or werewolves, it's safe to say everyone has seen the impact it has had on media and creative works as a whole. Out of every art form, it seems the unrestricted worlds of gaming allowed fantasy to flourish and prosper into a dominant force and create one of the most gripping, immersive and creative genres you can play. The RPG genre. For a brief summary and history of this genre, RPG stands for role-playing game, and it sees the player take control of a character they'll take through a story, or, where the name is derived from, a certain role. This can be blank slate characters you lead the stories of, seen in titles such as the Elder Scrolls or Fallout series, or the more common route of set stories with the character you play as, seen in various titles including The Witcher, Zelda, and so many more. They usually consist of a progression system containing XP and levelling, with skill trees to spend these points in. Some of the more complex titles even have multiple skill trees in allowing for in-depth customization. RPGs range from sci-fi to realistic to deeply immersive fiction, with the genre able to cover almost any setting and story. All of this together creates what many would describe as the perfect game genre that implements elements of adventure titles, puzzle games, and so many other genres. But how did we get to this so-called best genre? To find that out, turn your calendars back to 1937 and the publication of The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. It saw the birth of what many would describe as the first work of fantasy and fiction, influencing works for decades to come. I'm sure you're all familiar with Tolkien's work, but you may be left wondering, how did Tolkien and the fantasy world he forged create the RPG genre? As the years rolled by, and many were touched by the world of Lord of the Rings, it was inevitable that a larger audience would be influenced, ultimately culminating in the release of Dungeons & Dragons. This board game challenged all conventional rules. There was no set map, story or world. In fact, part of the game is you make that up. You create a role, which you play, making it arguably the first modern role-playing game. The same demographic that played Dungeons & Dragons also loved these new things called video games, which stretched the influence of Middle-earth to the digital world. Video games, where you could choose species, stats and characters to take the role of, became more and more prominent and popular, eventually forming their own genre through titles such as The Elder Scrolls and Final Fantasy, called the role-playing game. The genre would be met with critical acclaim right off the bat, with many critics praising the options of choice in narrative, ability to create your own story, and the immersing worlds and gameplay created by the genre. Whilst these early titles had some success, arguably the genre's most defining achievement came in the 2011 title Skyrim, which brought the genre from being viewed as nerdy to a more mainstream audience, selling over 60 million copies. Since then, 4 RPG games have won Game of the Year, being the most from any genre, making it clear that it produces some of the highest quality titles. To analyse how fantasy has impacted RPGs, let's dive further into some of these winners to see how fantasy affects them. It tells the story of Geralt of Rivia, who kills monsters for money as his profession as a witcher. He uses potions, swords and magic to achieve this in a grand world and narrative that scales hundreds of hours. It's pretty clear to immediately see the influence fantasy had on this title, being there from its very inception from Sapkowski's novels. The use of an RPG title allows for Geralt to use potions such as in the books, give the player choices to make the narrative their own, and fight a wide array of monsters found in the books. Simply put, any other genre wouldn't work, and The Witcher's fantasy roots force the RPG genre to fruition. To add to this, look no further than another Game of the Year winner. Zelda has a long history and influence of fantasy, with creator Shigeru Miyamoto himself acknowledging Tolkien's influence on the series. 2017 Game of the Year winner Breath of the Wild is all you need to play to prove this. The game contains all the fantasy characteristics you'd expect: strange species, a grand adventure, and a large world. Even the main character Link has pointy ears like an elf. Whilst not specifically an RPG game, Breath of the Wild is one of those games that takes RPG elements and applies it into another genre. This can be seen through the inventory management, potion and cooking system, and large overarching plot in a vast world, which are all staples of an RPG. Zelda isn't an RPG game, but due to being heavily fantasy oriented is pushed into having these RPG elements. And that's another factor of fantasy's impact on gaming. Many other genres implement RPG elements due to their influence from fantasy, which can be shown best through the highest rated game of all time and another Zelda game. This N64 staple is an adventure puzzle title. It's very clear RPG elements are within the game to its very core. The option to choose dialogue choices, the inventory management again, upgrades, and the vast explorable worlds all coalesce with a complex plot that shows the game's RPG blood. Fantasy is drenched within the roots of these RPG games, and more specifically, Tolkien has clearly inspired many of the best gaming titles. But it's not just his works that affect the genre. Author George R.R. Martin, who wrote A Song of Ice and Fire, or as its television counterpart is known, Game of Thrones, has also had this impact. The 2022 Game of the Year winner, Elden Ring, had the story written by none other than Martin himself, with the deep lore and immersive world, some of the aspects of the game that were heavily praised being all his work. The compelling story of Elden Ring and the unique personality it has is what makes it so great, and again, fantasy is to thank for this. So what about fantasy draws the RPG genre in? I think that comes down to many factors, and can also be attributed to how fantasy was what developed the RPG genre. The first factor contributing to the dominance of fantasy in RPG games is due to the fact that fantasy usually involves complicated plots and complex characters. You couldn't throw sacred stories like this into a platforming game or an action game, as they would most likely be wasted, so developers decide to use RPG genre to fulfill their fantasy plots. Furthermore, RPG games are often high stakes, grand adventures that take hundreds of hours to complete, with it not being a coincidence that fantasy works are more often than not grand in scale. The similarities are like a chicken and the egg situation, but in this case the chicken having a helmet and a sword. What I'm getting at is, do RPGs only have these elements as they are derived from fantasy, or does fantasy fit in so well because RPG games have these elements? There isn't a definitive answer, although I'd opt in for the former, as fantasy has been around long before role-playing games, and is most likely what defined the genre the way it is now. So it's safe to say, almost every title is influenced by fantasy. It's clear to see some of the best titles come from the RPG genre. Fantasy or not, role-playing games have and will influence games for generations to come, with their complex stories, developed characters, boundary-breaking gameplay, and most importantly of all, influence from fantasy works like Tolkien. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please leave a like and subscribe, and check out some of my other content, perhaps the one on screen. Thank you for watching. Leave a comment if you enjoyed, but for now, goodbye.